The wind carried dust across the endless plains, swirling it into the late afternoon light. A man on horseback slowed his pace as he crested a rise, squinting at the valley below. He had ridden for miles, following the trail of letters and promises, till finally he reached the settlement where his life was meant to change. He wasn't a man given to dreaming. He valued order, rules, and the kind of plain predictability a frontier bride was supposed to bring. Marriage, in his mind, was meant to be steady and useful, like a well-built fence or a water pump that never failed. A partner who worked hard, kept quiet, and knew her place in a world still half wild, that was all he expected, and all he thought he wanted. The clapboard church sat crooked in the distance, its white paint already peeling from sun and wind. A cluster of cabins dotted the land around it, smoke rising from thin chimneys. The territory wasn't forgiving. The soil was stubborn, the summers dry, the winters merciless. Yet this was where people carved out new beginnings, binding their fates to the land with sweat and sacrifice. He had come here for that very reason, to start a family, to anchor himself. What he didn't know was that fate was waiting, not as plain and modest as he'd imagined, but wild, untamed, and dangerous to every boundary he had set for himself. When he dismounted, the sound of boots striking hard ground echoed in the stillness. He tied his horse to the post outside the general store, running his hand down the animal's neck as though steadying himself. Inside the store, whispers had already stirred. Folks knew he was here to claim his bride. They watched with quiet curiosity, wondering what sort of woman would step out to meet him. He'd been promised simplicity. The matchmaker had written in her neat, practiced script that the young woman was of good character, accustomed to hard work, and plain in her ways. Nothing in those words prepared him for what came next. The church bell tolled once, a hollow sound carried by the wind. He turned toward it, expecting to see a modest figure step forward, someone dressed in faded calico, head bowed, hands folded. Instead, a woman emerged from the path near the chapel, her skirts catching dust with every stride. The moment she appeared, the air seemed to shift. Her dark hair was caught under the wide brim of a hat, but strands had escaped, blowing free across her face. Her eyes lifted, meeting his across the space, steady and unflinching. She walked as though the earth belonged to her, as though no hardship could break her spirit. He froze. This was not plain. This was not modest. This was something fierce, something that made his rules tremble at their foundations. She stopped only a few feet from him, her chin lifted, her voice low but sure when she finally spoke. "So you're the man they say I'm to marry?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge, wrapped in the calm cadence of her words. He opened his mouth, but for the first time in years he found no easy answer. Her beauty was the kind that unsettled a man, wild as the desert sky, and just as untamed. He thought of the life he had planned, the neat rows of crops, the silent evenings, the steady rhythm of duty on felt it falter. His rules had no place for a woman like this. And yet something in him shifted, a spark he couldn't name. Around them, the small crowd had fallen silent, watching with the kind of sharp interest only frontier folk carried. They knew stories began in moments like these, exacted raw and destined to test every boundary. The matchmaker's letters had promised a plain bride, but promises could be misleading. Here stood a woman who seemed to carry storms in her eyes and fire in her heart. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "I came here expecting." He let the words hang, unable to finish them. She arched an eyebrow, waiting, daring him to say what he truly thought. And in that pause, he realized something. This was no mistake, no accident of fate. This was a test, one that would unravel him if he let it. The horizon stretched wide behind her. Mountains rising in jagged lines, the sun casting long shadows across the land. Somewhere, a hawk cried overhead, circling slowly, as if marking the moment. He felt the weight of the choice before him. He could turn away, demand the bride he was promised, the life he had planned. Or he could step forward, into a storm he could not control. Toward a woman who threatened to tame his soul, even as she defied every expectation he had carried. She did not flinch. She did not soften. She simply waited, her presence daring him to decide. And as the silence thickened between them, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. That was the moment he knew nothing in his life would ever be the same. And yet, he hadn't spoken his answer. Not yet. The rules he had lived by still clawed at him, warning him against fire, against beauty too wild to cage. But his heart, traitorous and stubborn, was already moving toward her. The wind rose again, carrying dust across their boots, pulling at her skirts and tugging at the brim of his hat. The crowd shifted, sensing the tension. Someone coughed, another muttered under their breath. The bell from the church tolled again, breaking the silence, but still he did not speak. Instead, he took a step forward. Just one. Her eyes narrowed slightly, watching, measuring him. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain of his own strength. He had faced storms, outlaws, and endless lonely nights. But never had he faced a woman who looked at him as though she could strip him of every rule he thought unbreakable, and she was only just beginning. Would he claim the life he had planned, safe and orderly? Or would he surrender to the untamed fire before him, knowing it might consume him whole? The answer lingered in the silence, waiting for his choice. As the frontier stretched endless and unyielding around them, the silence between them stretched until it felt like the air itself might crack. He kept his eyes on hers, still unable to look away. And she held his gaze with a steadiness that unnerved him more than any danger he had faced on the open plains. He had been a man of rules for so long that he thought nothing could shake him. But here, in this settlement, carved out of dust and sweat, a woman had done it in a single moment without lifting a hand. The crowd slowly began to disperse. Some murmuring about supper, others dragging children along by the hand. They knew better than to linger too long on another's private matters, yet curiosity clung in the air. Folks here didn't often see something stir up the dust like this. Life in the territory was usually plain and hard births, deaths, crops, droughts. But the spark of a story had lit before their eyes, and the memory of it would travel in whispers long after the sunset. She finally spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that pressed against his chest. "If you thought I'd be meek and mild, you were told wrong. I've lived too much and seen too much to play that part." Her words were not harsh, only honest. As though she had learned long ago that truth was the only weapon worth carrying, he found his voice at last. Though it came rough and uneven, "I expected a plain bride, someone who'd fit the life I've built." He let out a breath and adjusted the brim of his hat. "But you don't seem plain at all." Something flickered in her expression, amusement. Perhaps, or maybe defiance. "Plain doesn't survive out here," she said softly, almost to herself. Her eyes moved past him, toward the wide horizon where mountains loomed. For a moment he saw the distance in her gaze, as if her mind carried burdens far heavier than any he knew. They began to walk, side by side, though not close enough to brush against each other. She led the way toward the cabin she had been living in, a small structure on the edge of the settlement with its roof patched in more than one place. The boards creaked when she pushed the door open. Inside, the space was spare but clean: one table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed tucked against the wall. A rifle rested above the doorframe. Polished, though clearly well used, he stepped in behind her, taking in the room with the sharp eye of a man who measured everything. She noticed and gave a small smile. "Don't expect lace curtains or polished floors. I've done what I can with what little I've had." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked again at the rifle, then at her hands, as she set a kettle on the stove. They were strong hands, steady, with the marks of hard work, not the soft, careful hands of the picture he had carried in his mind when he thought of a wife. He realized then how much of her story he didn't know. "Where'd you come from?" he asked at last, settling into the chair. Her back stiffened slightly as she poured water. "Here and there. I've been on my own since I was young. The West doesn't ask questions, so long as you work hard and keep to yourself." She paused, glancing over her shoulder at him. "Why did you come?" "Truly." He leaned back, arms folding across his chest. "I wanted a family. A place that's mine. Rules, order, A way to keep the chaos out? The land's hard, but I thought marriage would bring something steady into it. His eyes caught hers. Instead, I find myself looking at someone who feels like chaos itself. Her lips curved, though not into a smile. Maybe steady isn't what you need. He let her words linger, turning them over in his mind. All his life he had believed in structure. A fence around his land? A ledger to keep accounts. A set of rules to keep his heart safe. But now he wondered if those fences would only hold him prisoner when something freer and wilder stood before him, as the kettle hissed. She poured water into 2 tin cups and handed one to him. The steam curled between them, filling the silence. He studied her across the small table, noticing how the firelight caught in her eyes. They were not the eyes of someone untouched by hardship. They carried storms, losses, and maybe secrets too deep to speak. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin walls, carrying the cry of coyotes from the hills. The settlement would be settling down for the night, lamps glowing faintly in the distance. Inside, the two of them sat across from each other. Strangers tied together by words on paper, but bound now by something heavier: expectation, tension, and the mystery of what lay beneath the surface. He wanted to ask her more. He wanted to press about her past, about why she had agreed to the match, about what she expected from him. But he held back. Something in her posture warned him that questions might open doors better left closed, at least for now. Instead, he said, "The land I've claimed is good soil, if worked hard. It's a half-day's ride from here. There's a house frame set, needs finishing. That was meant to be our start." He hesitated, then added, "But I don't know if you'll want that life." Her eyes softened for just a moment, though the steel returned quickly. "I've wanted many things, and most of them were taken from me. I don't ask for much anymore. Only that I have the freedom to be who I am. If you can allow that, maybe I'll stand beside you." The word struck him deeper than he expected. He realized then that whatever rules he had brought with him would not survive if she stayed. She wasn't asking for comfort or luxury. She was asking for the freedom to live untamed. The night deepened, shadows pressing against the small windows. They spoke little more, each lost in thought. He tried to picture the days ahead her beside him in the fields, her laughter echoing against the mountains, or perhaps her fire clashing against his stubbornness until sparks flew. He could not tell if the image was promise or warning. When he rose to leave, she followed him to the door. The moon hung low, silver light spilling across the land. He adjusted his hat, ready to walk back to the general store where he had rented a room. Before he stepped off the porch, she said quietly, "You should know, I've made enemies. Not everyone will be glad to see me wed. If you choose me, you'll choose my burdens too." He turned sharply, but she gave no more. Her gaze held firm, daring him once again to walk away, or step deeper into a storm he didn't yet understand. The coyotes cried again, closer now. He stood there, caught between the safe path he had always clung to and the dangerous, thrilling unknown she represented. And as the cold night wind swept across the plain, he realized his choice would not only shape his own life, but perhaps decide whether he would survive it all. Would he walk away before it was too late? Or would he let himself be drawn into her fire, knowing that it could burn everything he had built? The answer still waited, heavy and unresolved, as the night closed in around them. The night after their first uneasy meeting lingered heavy in his mind. Sleep came only in broken pieces, each one disturbed by the echo of her warning. Enemies. The word gnawed at him. Out on the frontier, a man learned quickly that enemies rarely announced themselves in advance. They came in shadows, in ambush, in whispers that spread through a town before a bullet ever flew. And yet she had said it plainly, almost as if daring him to turn back before it was too late. When dawn came, saddled his horse with movements that were sharper than usual. The sky blushed red along the horizon, and he told himself it was only the day beginning, though part of him took it as an omen. He rode to her cabin again, feeling the weight of choice press down harder with every hoofbeat. She was already outside, chopping wood with strong, deliberate swings, her braid falling loose against her back. The sight of her, wild and unflinching, stirred the same conflict he had felt since she first met his eyes. He was drawn to her, yet every instinct warned him that she was no ordinary bride and no ordinary promise. "Morning," he said. Sliding off his horse, she didn't stop swinging the axe. "Morning." He leaned against the fence post, watching her. "What did you mean last night about enemies?" She rested the axe head against the stump, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "It means exactly what it sounded like. I've made my way by standing my ground. Not everyone took kindly to it." Her tone was steady, but there was a shadow in her eyes. Men don't like being told no, especially out here where they think the law bends to their will. He felt a tightening in his chest. "You mean there are men who will come after you?" "Not just me," she said quietly. "Anyone standing near me?" Her gaze flicked to him, sharp and direct. "That includes you." The air seemed to thicken between them. He wanted to demand answers, names, reasons. But something in her silence told him the story ran deep, maybe deeper than he was ready to face. And still, he didn't walk away. Later that day, whispers reached him in the general store. Old men leaned against the barrels of flour, trading quiet words about her past. Some said she had once turned down the son of a rancher, humiliating him in front of others. Others claimed she had fought to keep her land when men tried to take it, even standing with a rifle against them until they backed off. Every version painted her as someone too bold, too wild, too unwilling to bow. And in each version, there was a thread of dangermen who had not forgotten the sting of her defiance. That evening, he returned to her cabin again. She was mending a shirt by lamplight, her face soft in the glow, though her posture still carried that quiet readiness of someone who had learned not to let her guard fall. He sat across from her, the words heavy on his tongue. "Folks are talking," he said. "They say you've crossed men who don't forgive easily." Her hands paused in their stitching, but she didn't look up. "People love a story. Doesn't matter if it's true, so long as it gives them something to chew on." "But is it true?" His voice was low, edged with the need to know. She lifted her gaze at last, eyes steady on his. "I've stood my ground, that much is true. If a woman doesn't, she gets trampled. Maybe I've made enemies along the way, but I've also survived." He wanted to press her further, but a knock on the door broke the moment. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind that carried no patience. She set the needle aside and stood, every line of her body tense. When she opened the door, two men stood on the porch, dust covering their coats, the brims of their hats pulled low. Their eyes slid past her to him, measuring, weighing. "We heard there's to be a wedding," one said, his tone slow, mocking. Funny, considering she's already made her place known around here, she didn't flinch. "You've had your say before. Best ride on?" The taller man smirked. "Careful, girl. Not every man you cross will let you walk away." His hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip, but he didn't draw. The warning was enough. She held her ground, though the air crackled with danger. Finally, the men turned and stepped off the porch, their boots crunching in the dirt, their laughter carrying into the night. When the door closed, silence pressed heavy between them. He stood, his jaw tight. "Who are they?" Her voice was flat. "Men who think everything belongs to them. Men who don't forgive, and you didn't think I needed to know?" She turned on him, her eyes blazing. "I told you. If you stay, you share the danger. You think a plain bride would keep you safe? The frontier doesn't care how plain or modest a woman is. It only cares how much strength she's got when the wolves come circling." He said nothing, but the truth of her words dug into him. For the first time, he began to realize that the conflict wasn't only between them or within himself. There were forces outside, hungry and bitter, waiting to test them both. Over the next days, tension deepened. He worked beside her, helping mend the roof, patch fences, and carry water, but the shadow of those men never left his mind. Every sound in the distance made him glance toward the horizon. Every rider passing through town made his hand twitch toward the holster at his side. She carried on with the same fierce calm, though he could see in her eyes that she was just as aware. At the same time, he began to notice more about her. The way she carried herself among the townsfolk, never meek, never apologizing for taking up space. The way children flocked to her, as though they sensed strength in her presence. The way she laughed, sharp and quick, though it never lingered long. Beneath the wildfire, there was a loneliness she tried to hide, and he felt it pulling at him in ways he couldn't explain. Yet the danger pressed closer. Rumors grew that the rancher's son, still bitter from her defiance, was stirring trouble. Some claimed he had been drinking hard, swearing that he'd have revenge one way or another. Others said he had hired men from out of town, gun hands who knew no law. Each whisper tightened the knot of conflict, drawing the circle closer around them. Still, he didn't leave. Each day he told himself he should walk away before it went too far, before her storm swallowed him whole. And yet each day he found himself riding back to her cabin, working beside her, sharing meals, sharing silence. The rules that had once guided him began to feel flimsy, like paper in the wind. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the plains, they stood together by the fence line. She leaned on the post, her eyes distant. "You could still leave," she said softly. "Take your land, build your house, find someone who'll give you peace. No one would blame you." He stared at her, the firelight catching in her hair, the weight of the moment pressing hard. "Maybe peace was never what I needed." Her lips parted as if to speak. But before she could, the distant sound of hooves carried across the land. Not one horse, but several. Riders, moving fast, heading their way. The air thickened, and the silence between them snapped into sharp readiness. She straightened, her hand brushing against the rifle resting by the post. He placed a hand on his revolver, every muscle tight. The riders were coming closer, dust rising behind them like a storm on the horizon. Neither of them spoke. They only waited, breath held, as the sound of trouble grew louder with every heartbeat. Would this be the moment their enemies struck, or was it only the beginning of something darker? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. As the sun slipped lower and the riders closed in, the riders came fast, their silhouettes black against the dying light. Dust trailed them, curling into the sunset like smoke, warning of trouble long before their faces could be seen. He stood rigid beside her, every nerve sharpened. She raised the rifle with calm precision, but he saw the way her jaw clenched. This wasn't just a visit. It was a warning, or worse. They slowed as they neared the fence line, horses snorting, the creak of leather loud in the tense silence. 5 men in all, their hats pulled low, eyes hard and familiar with violence. At their center rode the rancher's son. His smirk was wide, his eyes were cold as iron. He let the silence drag before speaking. "Seems you've been busy," he drawled, gaze sliding from her to the man standing beside her. "Didn't figure you'd have company." She held the rifle steady, pointed just low enough to warn but not provoke. "State your business and be gone." He leaned in the saddle, letting out a laugh that carried no humor. "You embarrassed me once, and I let it slide longer than I should have. But then I hear word you're too merry." "A fine joke, marrying, when you've got debts unpaid." His gaze hardened. "You think a stranger can protect you?" "Think again." The man at her side shifted slightly, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "If you've got a grievance, speak it plain," he said evenly. "Otherwise, ride on." The rancher's son sneered. "Grievance? You've stepped into something you don't understand. She doesn't belong to you, stranger. She belongs to what she's sown here. And that comes with a price." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. She took one step forward, the barrel of her rifle steady. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice cutting like steel. "Now take your men and ride before you regret it." The tension snapped tighter. The riders shifted in their saddles, hands near holsters, ready but waiting for a signal. He felt his pulse pound against his ribs, every second stretching longer than it should. The air was thick with the smell of horses, sweat and gun oil. One wrong move, and the night would split open with gunfire. Finally, the rancher's son spat into the dirt, his smirk returning. "This isn't over," he said softly. "You can't hide behind a stranger forever. When the time comes, he'll learn what you're worth." With a sharp pull of the reins, he turned his horse, and the others followed. Dust rising again as they rode back into the horizon, silence clung after their departure, heavy and unbroken. She lowered the rifle, her hand steady, though her face was pale. He let out a slow breath, loosening the grip he hadn't realized was locked around his revolver. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Next time, they won't just be talking." He studied her, the strength in her posture, the shadows in her eyes. "Then we'll be ready," he said. But even as he spoke the words, he knew readiness was a thin shield against men who carried grudges like loaded guns. The next days stretched long. Each one waited with the knowledge of what was coming. He worked the land with her, reinforcing fences, setting watch from the porch, keeping his revolver close at hand. At night, the wind carried every sound sharp across the plains, the cry of coyotes, the rustle of brush, and each one made his heart lurch, expecting hoofbeats in the dark. In town, whispers grew louder. Folks gave sidelong glances when they walked past, some with pity, some with fear. No one openly offered help, but their silence spoke volumes. The rancher's family was powerful, their reach wide. To stand against them was to invite ruin. One evening, as the last light faded, he found her sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. The rifle rested across her lap, her fingers absently tracing the worn wood of the stock. He sat beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. "You don't scare easy," he said. She gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Fear doesn't change the outcome. You either stand or you fall." She paused, then added softly, "But it doesn't mean I don't feel it." Her honesty struck him. For all her strength, she was still human, still vulnerable, and yet she carried her burdens with a grace that unsettled him more than any gunman. He wanted to tell her that he would protect her, he would stand against whatever came. But the words caught in his throat, because promises on the frontier were fragile things, too easily broken by lead and blood. The days bled into each other, tension growing with every sunrise. And then, one night it broke. The sound of hoofbeats shattered the silence, closer this time, faster. He was on his feet before the echo settled, pulling her into the shadows of the cabin. The riders came hard, their torches flaring against the dark, their laughter sharp and cruel. They didn't stop at the fence this time. They rode straight through it, splintering wood, circling the cabin like wolves. Flames licked the night air as one man hurled a torch onto the roof of the shed, dry wood catching fast. She raised her rifle, firing a shot that dropped one of the torches from a rider's hand. The crack of gunfire split the night, horses rearing, men shouting. He drew his revolver, steady and sharp, each bullet a warning shot near enough to scatter, but not kill. The riders returned fire, bullets tearing through the cabin walls, the hiss of smoke and sparks rising around them. "Out the back," he shouted, grabbing her arm. Together, they slipped through the rear door, the cover of darkness their only shield. They ran toward the small gully behind the cabin, gunfire chasing their steps, the glow of fire rising behind them. In the cover of brush, they dropped low, breaths harsh, hearts hammering. The riders still circled, shouts cutting through the night, the shed burning bright. She gripped his arm, eyes wide but fierce. "They won't stop. Not until one of us falls." He looked at her, sweat and soot streaking her face, her hair wild around her shoulders, and in that moment he felt the full weight of what he had chosen. This was no plain life, no steady path. This was fire, danger, and a fight that might take everything from him. And yet he could not turn away. The gunfire eased, replaced by the sound of mocking laughter. The riders weren't gone. They were circling, waiting, drawing the noose tighter. He knew this was only the beginning, that the true clash had yet to come. As the fire roared against the night sky, painting their world in flames and shadow, he tightened his grip on his revolver and met her gaze. "We're not running," he said. "Not tonight." The roar of the fire mixed with the pounding of hooves, and the air thrummed with the certainty of what was coming. The storm was here, and it would not pass quietly. Would they survive the night? Would the frontier claim them both before dawn? The question hung heavy, unanswered, as the riders closed in again, and the fire spread wider across the land. The fire spread quickly, its glow casting long, dancing shadows across the plain. The men on horseback circled like vultures, their laughter cutting through the crackle of flames. He crouched low in the brush with her, his revolver ready, the smell of smoke heavy in his lungs. The land that was supposed to bring him peace had turned into a battlefield, and the rules he once held tight to had already turned to ash. She shifted beside him, her rifle steady across her knees. We can't wait them out. They'll burn everything down just to smoke us out. If we want to live, we have to face them. He looked at her in the firelight. Her eyes blazed with the same untamed spirit that had unsettled him from the first moment, but now he understood it better. She wasn't just fire for the sake of burning. She was fire that refused to be extinguished, no matter who tried to put it out. He nodded once. Then we fight. They moved together through the shadows, slipping closer to the cabin, where the riders had dismounted. The men were loud, their confidence swelling with the crackle of flames. One leaned against a fence post, another kicked over a barrel, their laughter sharp and careless. They thought they had already won. Her first shot cut through that certainty. The man at the post dropped before he could draw his weapon. Silence fell for the briefest moment before chaos erupted. Shouts filled the air, gunfire sparking in the night. He returned fire, each shot measured, pushing the men back toward their horses. The flames roared higher, throwing sparks across the dirt, but the fight was no longer about fear. It was about survival, about refusing to bend. The rancher's son stormed forward, his face twisted in rage. "You think you can defy me?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "You'll regret ever setting foot on this land." Her voice rose clear above the gunfire. "This land isn't yours. It never was." She fired again, her shot grazing his arm, sending him stumbling back with a curse. The other men hesitated, their loyalty shaken. They had come for easy intimidation, not a fight with two people who refused to yield. And in that hesitation, the tide shifted. One rider bolted for his horse, another dragged his wounded companion back. The rancher's son shouted after them, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. The last standoff came sudden and sharp. He stepped into the open, revolver steady, facing the rancher's son head-on. Smoke curled between them, the firelight painting everything in red and gold. "It ends here," he said, his voice low but unshaken. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The night held its breath, waiting. Then the rancher's son went for his gun. But he was slower, his rage making him clumsy. The shot rang out, clean and final. The rancher's son dropped to the dirt, his weapon falling from his hand. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of flames and the sound of fleeing hoofbeats. The remaining men rode hard into the night, leaving behind their fallen leader. The threat that had hung over them for so long broke in that single moment, like a storm finally spent. She lowered her rifle, her chest heaving, her face pale in the firelight. He crossed to her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. For the first time since he met her, he saw the fire in her eyes soften, just slightly. As the weight of survival settled over them both, they worked quickly to put out what flames they could, beating back the fire with wet sacks and buckets of water until the shed was nothing but smoldering ruins. The cabin still stood, scarred but unbroken, much like the two of them. When the last sparks died, they sank onto the porch, exhaustion pressing heavy. The night stretched quiet around them, the danger finally gone. He looked at her, the wild beauty of her spirit still undeniable, even in her weariness. "You were right," he said softly. "Plain doesn't survive out here, but neither does a man who refuses to change." She met his eyes, and for the first time, a true smile touched her lips. "Then maybe you're starting to understand." Days passed, and the whispers in town changed. People spoke of the night the rancher's son was brought down, of how it stood against five and survived. Some told the story with awe, others with caution, but all agreed on one thing: she was no longer a woman to be pitied or judged. She was someone who had fought for her freedom and won. He worked beside her to rebuild. The charred remains of the shed replaced with sturdier walls, the fences mended, the land tended once more. And though danger always lingered on the frontier, there was a new kind of quiet between them. Not the silence of strangers, but the steady rhythm of something stronger growing in time. They stood together before the small church where they had first met. The townsfolk gathered around. Their vows were simple, spoken in voices steady from all they had endured. There were no lace curtains, no promises of easy days, only the truth that they would face the storms together, come what may. Afterward, as the sun dipped low and the horizon stretched wide, he looked at her and thought of the life he had once imagined: a plain bride, a quiet home, rules to keep the world neat and safe. That life was gone, burned away with the flames of that night. In its place was something wilder, something harder, but something far more real. She had shattered his rules, tamed his soul in ways he hadn't known were possible, and given him not the life he thought he wanted, but the life he truly needed. Together, they had claimed a piece of the unforgiving land and made it their own. And as the coyotes cried in the distance, and the stars brightened over the frontier, he realized that some stories weren't meant to be simple. They were meant to be hard, wild, and unforgettable, just like her.